When I was young, I listened to the radio, waiting for my favorite
Welcome to the
songs.
internationally famous Radio Theatre.
When they played, I'd sing along. It made me smile. Those old melodies still sound so good to me as they melt the years away.
Here they come. Adrian Elsie.
When a girl marries.
Lux Radio Theatre.
Good morning, boys.
Hello, world.
Howdy, everybody.
Fan doodly.
Yibbity folks.
Good morning, Sandy Sparrow.
What do you say, guys?
It's huge. It is.
The cream of Australian radio talent.
All my best memories come back clearly to me. Some can even make me cry, just like before. It's yesterday once more.
This is Davey saying good night and thanks for listening.
At his peak, more than half the population tuned into Jack Davey's radio shows, the largest Australian audience ever.
You nervous? Yeah, plenty.
This radio icon was the leader of a vast lineup of actors, comedians, singers and announcers who have entertained and informed us for more than 80 years.
When I count three, cut. 1, 2, 3.
Hello, I'm Mike Hammond. In any given week, radio broadcasting reaches 98% of all Australians, making it by far the most popular of all our mass media. For more than 80 years, the stars of radio have been trusted companions that we've invited into our lives. They've entertained us as kids, played us music as we fell in love, kept us informed as we worked and played, and included us in all the momentous news and sporting events. Their story is the history of Australian radio. I love radio. I started my broadcasting career at a station out in the bush, and I'm proud to be your host as we pay tribute to such a wonderful institution. Joining me will be some talented broadcasters from past and present who'll help to guide us along the way. One of them is a much-loved comedian who is one of the stars of radio's hilarious Naked Vicar show, Nolene Brown.
Thanks, Mike. These days, most of the radio shows I listen to are made up of various combinations of news, current affairs, celebrity interviews, sport, music and talkback, all held together by some very talented personalities. But there was a time before television came along when radio captivated and enthralled us with carefully crafted radio plays. Smartly dressed actors would stand around microphones reading from their scripts, while behind them, technicians would create ingenious and brilliantly accurate sound effects. Music would come and go, matching the mood of the moment. And at home, listeners would give a free rein to their imaginations and enter a private fantasy world, a world that became known as the theatre of the mind.
The best-known fanfare in radio, heralding the radio event of the year.
Lux Radio Theatre is back on the air.
There was a time when families had only one radio receiver. It was a piece of fine furniture that stood proudly in the corner of the living room.
I remember as a child, as a young boy with my parents, on a Sunday night, the Lux Radio Theatre came on at 8 o'clock, and we probably had a box of Minties or chocolates or something, and we'd listen with the lights turned out. And it really did come alive.
Hey, did you see him? Who? The ghost.
Oh, stop pointing that gun at me. It might go off.
This? It's not loaded. See? Come on, bird. Take his leg.
The light's there. I'll drag him off my neck.
Oh, he bit me. Stop twisting my arm.
Look out, let me crack him one.
It's the butler.
Where?
The butler?
I don't know what it was about the radio. We would sit down and watch the radio. And in the same way that, people now come home and watch Home and Away and Neighbours or whatever, I'd come home and watch radio serials.
The dream got worse. The voice was much closer. I thought I could see its face. And all of a sudden it got its hand round my throat. Then I woke up yelling out something. But when it was dark, pitch dark, and the room was full of gas fumes, I just managed to get up and turn off the tap, and I managed to stagger across the window and open the curtains and...
there'd be a creaking door. Good evening, friends of the inner sanctum. And my brothers and I, we would turn out all the lights in the house and turn all the furniture upside down. Mum and Dad were out, of course. And turn off, and we'd scare ourselves stupid listening to this radio show in the dark. But it was what we did.
Silently through the night moves the faceless figure of a man bringing retribution and reward. This is the return of the Dark Stranger.
Radio broadcasting began officially in Australia in 1923, and the early shows were mainly live concerts, some scripted talks, a few children's shows, and what were quaintly called women's sessions. By the 1930s, with the Great Depression raging, radio was able to provide cheap home entertainment in the form of plays, written exclusively for the ear.
Goodbye, darling. That is my grandmother. She's very ill. She wants me to go over at once. See you later, Barton.
The Caltex Theatre was probably the creme a la creme for us actors in those days. It was live on a Sunday night in front of an audience at the Macquarie Auditorium in Phillip Street in those days. And you had to appear in dinner suits, and ladies all dressed up in evening dresses.
Who is it?
Me, darling.
Oh, come in, Jim.
Oh, Jill, it's so good to see you again.
Oh, kiss me, darling. Jim, dear, Grant phoned me this morning.
Grant phoned you? What about?
About a lot of things, Mr. Saunders. I told you I'd get you. And here it is.
Stop him, Jill.
He jumped through the window. Are you all right, dear?
Yes, I'm okay.
Early programs were produced live to air, but in the 1930s, the introduction of long-playing transcription records allowed shows to be copied and mailed around the country.
In our last broadcast, you remember, Inspector Feathers was on his way to historic Mount Mason.
Using the distribution made possible by this new form of sound recording, commercial stations began to form themselves into networks. Now, they could share production costs and, more importantly, share revenue from big national sponsors.
You all right, Feathers? Just my shoulder, I think.
And they were so good at what they did that if they did make a mistake, they could pick it up and go on with it. On the occasions where the situation was completely non-retrievable and they had to go back and start right from the very beginning, the producers weren't very happy because these discs that they were cutting onto, wax discs as they were pretty expensive.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second production in the new series of Lux Radio Theatre. Our play, George Orwell's 1984. Religion is abolished. God is rooted out. There is only Big Brother.
For a Caltex play, which was an hour play, we used to rehearse all Friday afternoon, all Saturday morning, all Sunday afternoon. Then we used to rush and get our evening clothes on and have something to eat and come back and do the show on the air, live.
Darling, there are 600 people beyond the door who've come to eat and drink and goggle. For the last hour and a half, we've been stared at, questioned, posed, criticised and photographed. Oh, darling, all I want is 30 seconds before the next 2 hours when exactly the same things will happen.
What can you do in 30 seconds?
I'll show you.
I used to do British character voices. I'd have a Cockney voice one day, and I'd do it like that the next.
Australia had the best radio actors in the world at that time. They could do any accent. If you listen to American programs, American TV shows, they don't even attempt to do the accents. But all the Australian actors could and did. And they did it very well.
How come you get these Yankee coffee nails?
Skipper, just tell me if you know him.
Why, love?
I told you, business good. I want him bad.
Sound effects were the essential illustrations in a radio play.
Look out, Jim. He's got a gun, too.
you'd have this record, and you'd have to go through from 1 to 16 tracks to find the right little track where there's a car horn sounding. And I can recall working in a drama live to air, and I got the wrong track. And unfortunately, it was a pig snort, which didn't quite fit in.
And there's quite a skill. I mean, a lot of them just sit in the corner and they have a whole tray of stuff and bells and small doors, which became the door. And but the one we all loved was Oscar Lansbury, who did nearly all the Macquarie shows for 2GB.
What the deuce? There's something wrong over at the cages, Dad. See? Through the window. The tent hands are all running. What's that they're shouting? Listen. It's nearer. That damned gorilla. He must have got loose from his cage again. Come on, Dad, but bring your gun. Right.
One of the sound effect operators, who won't give you his name, but in the mornings he was tremendous, but at lunchtime he hit the bottle a bit. And this particular afternoon we were doing a play, and he was supposed to slam the door. And instead of slamming the door, he fired a revolver. And Harry came out and said, "What on earth did you do that for?" Oh, he said, "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Dirth, I'm on the wrong page."
You dirty, rotten rascal, I'm going to shoot you. No sound effect. Come here. Why? I'm going to strangle you to death.
Choosing the right music to enhance the mood was a critical factor in the theatre of the mind.
I was nosedived by mosquitoes the size of helicopters and got to the other side of the swamp less 2 pints of blood. Emmy McGrath's cottage was modest, to say the least. I crept up to a window and saw her dear old ma was hard at work. She was busy putting a bottle of gin inside of her.
The great drama productions of the 1930s, 40s and 50s were a launching place for many illustrious careers in acting and writing.
Evie Hayes, stage star of Call Me Madam, presents the Macquarie Awards for 1953 at a special ceremony in Sydney. Margaret Christensen receives a bronze statuette and 100 guineas for her award as Outstanding Actress of the Year.
Peter Finch started in radio drama in Sydney and went on to a distinguished 30-year international career, winning multiple awards, including the Best Actor Oscar.
Your Honour, the Crown needs but one more piece of evidence to complete its case, and we have that evidence.
Now to Mr. Peter Finch for his male starring role as René Latour in The Laughing Woman.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks very much.
While the commercial stations had to produce popular drama that would attract audiences and advertisers, the ABC could afford to produce more complex programs. One memorable production was Fire on the Snow, the epic, tragic story of Scott of the Antarctic, written entirely in verse by Douglas Stewart. Another celebrated radio production was White Coolies, starring June Salter, about Australian women taken by the Japanese as prisoners of war.
Walk indoor sea.
Do you realise what this means, sister? Yes, I think so. Some of the Japs are setting up machine guns behind us, and it should be quick.
Fire! Ulti!
I remember being, in floods of tears, hearing something on radio, and I think my father came out and saw me in floods of tears and blamed my mother and said, "What is she listening to? Why is she crying?" But it could be very, very moving.
Theatre of the mind is the most powerful of any form of drama. It's what you don't see that you imagine, not what you see. It is only limited by the quality of the script and the quality of the actor and the quality of the sound effects. That's all. The rest of it is pure imagination. And it can, in the case of real horror drama, be absolutely terrifying.
The The coming of television in the late 1950s almost killed off radio drama, just as talking movies had ended the boom for vaudeville and live theatre. Thankfully, the ABC continued to produce great plays, and you can still hear high-quality drama to this day on ABC Radio National. Coming up, the serials and the stars that kept us all coming back for more. The big radio plays were produced to tell a whole story in one show, lasting up to an hour or more. And to reach the biggest audience, they went to air in the evening prime time. But in the era where most married women were housewives, the daytime wireless audience was almost entirely made up of women working at home. And so evolved the 15-minute radio serial that could be heard on the run. To guide us into the story of those daytime dramas, here's one of Australia's best-known broadcasters, Darren Hinch.
Thanks, Nolene. When I was a kid growing up in New Zealand, my mother, like all mothers, was glued to the radio for the morning serials from Australia while she did the housework. Sometimes, when off school, we got to listen too. I must have been 8 or 9, but I can still remember A True Story of Adult Love, Dr. Paul, and Portia Faces Life. The serial has always been a popular form of storytelling. The daytime radio serials told never-ending stories in hundreds, sometimes thousands of instalments. Stories where each episode ended with a tantalising invitation to tune in again tomorrow.
Presenting Chapter 3290 of When a Girl Marries, dedicated to those who are in love
and to all those who can remember. Did that move you?
Well, I don't know what happened between John and this Davis person, but it might be a good idea to find out.
What does Eve mean? This and other intriguing questions will be answered in the next chapter of When a Girl Marries.
So you had to have the best character, and I remember one station manager, whenever I wanted to sell him a serial, he'd say, "Reg, is there a bitch?" And if there was a bitch, he'd buy it. But you had to have, your woman had to be a bitch and the male the hero.
While some radio serials in the 1930s were imported from America, one of the first and most successful local producers was George Edwards. With his wife Nell Sterling, Edwards wrote, produced and acted in a string of successful shows, including the iconic series based on the lovable Steel Rudd characters, Dad and Dave.
Put them down. Now, look here, young fella. What you want on these corners is gates. If these mugs and the cars had to get out and open them, that'd slow down the traffic. Yeah, I'll mention that to the department. Here, come on now.
Well, it was because of the outbreak of the Second World War that the industry here became huge, because they couldn't get the shows out from America. And we had to develop our own industry, and there was so much talent, unused talent here, and they all had the opportunity.
Hello? Hello? Aye, it's me, Dr. Mack.
They did quarter hour after quarter hour all through the morning, and Portia Faces Life and 100 other titles I can never remember. They were programmed across the board, Monday to Thursday.
Portia Faces Life. The story of a courageous and beautiful woman.
Out of this new wartime industry rose powerful production houses like Artranza and AWA, and individual producers like Hector Crawford and Grace Gibson. Gibson was a feisty woman who arrived in Sydney from Hollywood with an eye for a good script, an ear for good radio acting, and a talent for business.
She was an amazing person. And really, you know, radio should never forget her.
Dossier on Demetrius.
At their peak in 1955, the Australian production houses were making hundreds of hours of radio serials every week.
So on the Sunday morning, we started recording at 9, and 2 hours later, we had recorded 8 episodes, 4 episodes an hour, 4 quarter-hour episodes an hour, no rehearsal, no preparation. I don't think we'd even seen the scripts, and there wasn't one error. And those 8 episodes went to air, and boom, it became a huge show.
They gave me the father's role, who was an old crusty sea captain who spoke like that. Remember, I was only 23 or 24. Well, they also gave me the son to play, and they put them both in the one scene. So I had to say, "Hello, Dad, how are you?" "Not too bad, son, but I'm really cranky with you." "Why are you cranky, Dad?" Oh, dear, that was difficult.
One of the most popular serials was Dr. Paul, which ran for 22 years, more than 4,600 episodes.
We bring you radio's great story of adult love, the story of Dr. Paul.
Is it because she's going to claim that Eileen Preston's in love with you? Oh, Paul, as though that matters.
Well, you've let talk of Eileen Preston upset you before.
Of course it upsets me. But I repeat, what does it matter about me? You're the one to be considered today. You're the one who needs some help and some moral support.
Writers had to write for the ear only, which meant either using a narrator to move the story along or being exceptionally creative to paint a complicated scene entirely in dialogue.
Don!
What's the matter?
Look at this red stain on the pass. It's blood.
Evidence by Mail, an air hostess adventure written by Peter Yeldham and featuring Margaret Christensen as Diana Drew.
Because they dealt with everyday life and were now locally produced, the serials were able to explore stories directly relevant to Australian society. One was a long-running George Edwards serial about everyday life called Martin's Corner, set in a grocery store. In 1947, the ABC began a serial designed specifically to reflect Australia's rural character and culture. Written by established playwright Gwen Meredith, it was called The Lawsons, and it was an instant hit. In time, it would change its name and become the world's longest-running radio serial.
The ABC presents episode 5000 of Blue Hills by Gwen Meredith.
Millions of Australians in towns, cities and on farms across the nation would stop work at 1 o'clock each day to hear the latest episode.
Blue Hills used to stop the country. They loved it.
It's the day of Granny's 90th birthday, and there's been a great deal of excitement. Typically, Ed doesn't approve of anniversaries. But meanwhile, back in Dunvegan, Meg and Jim review the day's proceedings with Granny. Well, Granny, what a morning you've had.
Yes, indeed.
Of course, the wireless wasn't only for adults back in those days. Radio plays to the imagination, and the wildest imaginations are found in the fertile minds of children. While the daytime was for women and the nighttime for families, in between were the early mornings and late afternoons, before and after school, when the children's sessions went to air. Coming up, the fantasy radio shows the children loved most.
Good morning, children. How are all my little friends today? I can say good morning to you in all your homes and schools in every part of Australia. Now you say good morning to me.
Good morning, Miss Fenner.
No one loved radio more than children. These days, childhood is less innocent and kids demand more spectacular forms of entertainment. But there was a time when kids tuned in to hear radio shows designed especially for them. And to guide us into this part of our story, here's a talented radio celebrity who's entertained children and adults alike, John Blackman.
Thanks, Darren. When I was a boy, I loved the kids' shows on radio. I'd sit quietly in front of our Bakelite radio, not unlike this one, and I'd thrill to the action and adventure stories of daring pilots and superheroes. The imagination of a child is boundless, And Australian radio quickly found its most enthusiastic audience was children. For the little ones, the session hosts were kindly announcers, playing the role of friendly guardian. And early radio seemed to have dozens of aunties and uncles.
How do you do, everybody? This is Uncle George.
One of the most successful of these children's hosts was Australia's first official radio announcer, Uncle George Saunders.
Thank you, do, everybody. Good night.
During the outbreaks of polio in the 1940s, children were kept at home, and some stations provided daytime children's hosts to be their companion, like 3DB's Jean Lawson in Melbourne.
Jean Lawson was just wonderful. She ran the most marvellous children's session with a serial called the Faker McGangeys, which children used to stand up on milk cartons to reach the microphone, to read little bits. And some of the actors that were used in radio serials later on actually cut their teeth on the Faker McGangeys.
In my very early days, I used to listen to 2SM because John Dunn had a program called Uncle Tom's Gang, and it was just a lot of fun, and people singing, young children singing, etc. And at the end of the show, he used to always say, "Okay, fine, well now, where will the train pull up and stop tonight?" And all the children would sing out their suburb and so on. And I used to sing out from home, Double Bay, Double Bay. But it never came to Double Bay, and because little did I know, we didn't have a railway station there.
How old are you, Andrew?
7, Uncle Tom.
7. And what are you going to recite?
The christening.
The christening. Now, big, go on.
The christening. What shall I call my dear little dormouse? His eyes are small and his tail is enormous.
A lot of people can't believe now that I was one of the singers on the show. It was a thing called Peter's Pals, and it was sponsored by Peter's Ice Cream, and in all the major cities, and also indeed in the country areas, Peter's Ice Cream sponsored these shows, but they're all different from station to station.
The stars of the children's sessions were encouraged to set a good example for young, impressionable minds.
And now it's time for children everywhere to clean their teeth, kiss mother and dad, and then off to bed. Good night, all.
With most children listening to radio before school, the breakfast session announcers began to invent cute companions in the form of talking animals or insects. One of the most famous of these characters was Gerald the Grasshopper, created on the spur of the moment when a cicada flew into announcer Russ Walkington's studio one day and landed on a turntable.
I don't know the reason, but I threw my voice into falsetto and had the creature say,
"Oh, sorry, Russ. Mucked up your program."
And Gerald the Grasshopper, why it was a grasshopper, I don't know, instead of Cecil Cicada, occurred.
Hello, girls and boys. My name's Gerald. I'm a grasshopper, and I can talk.
In the end, we had a fan club of 55,000 members and the largest daytime listening audience in Australia.
Goodbye now.
Gerald was created in 1952 and lasted an amazing 25 years on stations in Adelaide, Sydney and the Gold Coast. One of the most famous of all children's characters was on air from the 1950s to the 1980s, a sparrow who flew around Sydney in a miniature helicopter. His name was Sammy, and his creator was a breakfast announcer who reigned supreme as Sydney's king of the cornflakes for more than 3 decades, Gary O'Callaghan.
The Bank of New South Wales. Excuse me, you haven't forgotten anything? No, not a thing. Oh. It's 17 1/4 minutes past 8. Lovely day. Yes, 3rd of September. I noticed that.
And whenever I say Gary O'Callaghan to people, they always say Sammy Sparrow.
Gary O'Callaghan on 2UE was probably the first voice I can remember hearing on radio as a youngster, and listening to him do Sammy Sparrow, which when you're a kid you didn't know it was Gary doing the voice.
Top day, you look out over the harbour this morning.
The children of Sydney would not leave for school until Sammy's 5-minute session at 8:17 was over. He finally retired when his mate Gary called it a day.
Well, folks, after 50-odd years in the business, it's time for me to head off and find a new lifestyle. Thank you very much for making my life be such a happy one and to be part of this wonderful city of Sydney. And I know Sammy Sparrow would like to say something too. Geez, you're getting a bit grey-haired too. I guess you're off. Yes, I guess I'm off, and I guess you're off too. Yeah, well, I think I might stay with you. Oh, well, if you feel that way, why not, Sammy? Bye, everyone.
As childhood became less innocent in later years, so characters like Brisbane's Agro appeared.
Agro's holiday a day competition. 10 trips in 2 weeks. Love that equation.
While the young ones and their parents could be charmed by talking sparrows and grasshoppers and even aggressive little puppets, the older children craved adventure. In the 1940s, movies gave children cowboy heroes, and Smokey Dawson became their very own wholesome Australian cowboy adventurer.
An Australian star who's made good on American and British television arrives by plane at Kingsford Smith Airport, Sydney. Yes, sir, that's a box of real cactus flowers for Smokey Dawson.
Kellogg's, makers of your favourite breakfast cereals, present a new complete adventure with Australia's own...
Up, Flash! Up!
Smokey Dawson!
Because I never had a gun, I only had a stock whip and a bit of psychology.
In the 1950s, children would come home from school, put on the wireless, close their eyes, and set off on several hours of boys' own adventures.
You looked through the radio. You looked through the dial and you could see the people, you could see the animals, and you could see the caves. And the greatest punishment from my father wasn't a whack across the backside, it was click. Broken-hearted, it was... If you took the radio out of my life, and I think I fell in love with radio from about that point.
I had the pleasure of being the narrator of Tarzan, King of the Apes, for hundreds of episodes. And I had the pleasure 6 times, you can say, every Wednesday afternoon to say, Tarzan, King of the Apes, just like that.
Tarzan, King of the Apes.
We had 3 wonderful Tarzans over the years. The first one was Rod Taylor, the second was Bud Tingwell, and the third was Ray Barrett. And the intriguing thing is that all these guys got snafu'd and taken off because they got jobs elsewhere, overseas. They were such good actors, they did very well overseas as well.
Peg Christensen played Lois Lane in early episodes of Superman, opposite the actor Leonard Teal.
Len was wonderful. Up, up, and away!
Why, that's Ralph's voice. Now, where is he? Ah! I see him now. He's in the river. Up! Up! And away!
Another of the most popular serials was Search for the Golden Boomerang, developed by the pioneering producer George Edwards.
The Search for the Golden Boomerang.
It featured a young Aboriginal boy in the story. And one day on the show, and this shows you how young I was, this young boy said, I'm coming out now. I thought, my God, somebody's going to come out of the back of the radio. And I shot out of the room because I really thought there was somebody living inside the radio.
I'd say to the author in the morning, who was tapping away at his typewriter, what am I up to today? And he'd say, I don't know, I haven't written those episodes yet.
They wouldn't have read what was on the next page. So they'd be reading this, one particular incident, they're returning home on the horse-drawn carriage to their family home, so the sound effect guys in the background doing the clippity-clop, and they're reading the script. Ah, there you are, Doris. There's our lovely home, our beautiful cottage there, just ahead. On fire! The dangers of not reading ahead.
And I still think to this day that the most versatile actors in the history of radio in the world, I wouldn't get much of an argument there from people who've followed that.
A popular theme of the time was aeroplanes and daredevil pilots like Biggles and Hop Harrigan.
The Air Adventures of Hop Harrigan.
and there was one I loved, and you'd appreciate, Randy Stone. I cover the night beat for the Daily. I mean, as somebody who had decided when she was 11 she was going to be a journalist, Randy Stone was my hero.
Go away.
I've got to see you, Mrs. McGrath. It's urgent.
Who are you?
The name's Randy Stone, ma'am. Mind if I come in?
Nice looking fella.
But by far the biggest audience of all was for the ABC's children's session every afternoon at 5:30.
Over the Hubbard and Jack and Jill and Tom, the piper's son. Leave your cupboard, forget your spill, we're going to have some fun.
No other program in the history of Australian radio had a more lasting influence on young listeners. The session featured the legendary Argonauts Club, and tens of thousands submitted their paintings, poems and prose in order to win certificates of merit.
Hello, Argonauts. Good rowing.
The ABC's children's session lasted almost 40 years, finally going off the air in 1971.
Argonauts row, row, row.
The era of the radio shows designed exclusively for children eventually came to an end with the demise of the Argonauts. The pictures provided by TV replaced radio's theatre of the mind. However, before that happened, there was another style of radio show that older children could listen to with their parents. Coming up, the story of the time when big-budget entertainment shows ruled the airwaves with a cavalcade of funny and crazy comedy stars. The first broadcasters quickly learned that one ingredient was guaranteed to attract and keep an audience: entertainment. And the greatest of all entertainment was, of course, comedy. To take us into the world of the big radio variety shows, here's someone who often trod the boards in the theatre of the mind, Roger Clemson.
Thank you, John. In my days of acting in radio shows, I worked with many brilliant and very talented actors and singers who were all widely admired by the listening public, but I think the most popular of all were my colleagues in the comedy and variety shows. Now, many of them learned how to get the big laughs in the early formative years of radio when Australia was suffering in the Great Economic Depression. Audiences were demanding shows that would take their minds off the bad times, and that was the perfect opening for brilliant comedians who could play to that famous ability that we Australians have to laugh at hardship and poke fun at ourselves.
All the same, I wish you hadn't gone out for that Oxy welder. I don't like his tone.
I told him off last night.
Why, what did he say?
He said I was a refrigerator girl.
And what did you say?
I said I may be a refrigerator girl, but you're not the one to defrost me.
That'll be near enough.
It was a new skill for actors to perform comedy sketches live in a theatre, complete with sight gags that would simultaneously make sense to the radio audience. But the best comics soon discovered the gags could ride successfully on the imagination of the listener.
You can do things in radio comedy that you can't do on film or television or anything. You know, we're doing a dentist sketch. And he says, open your jaw. Now, we're going to ratchet, right? They go, rrr. Yeah, that's the jaw opening. Wider, rrr. Wider, rrr. Wider, rrr. And then he said, right, I'll put my head inside the mouth, you see. I said, then he speaks. He says, let me see. And they put the echo chamber on, you see. To break up the sound. And he said, that's quite a cavity you have in that tooth. I don't know what the person at home imagined, but it used to get laughs.
On the heels of the Depression came the 1940s and more grim times with World War II. Australians needed more than ever to laugh. Giant variety shows attracted listeners in their millions, and oh, how they laughed.
You can't get away with that Molly Roberts stuff.
Well, as I said before, what's Molly Roberts got that I haven't got?
Nothing, but you've had it longer.
The crazy gang from Mackackie Mansion, Mo, Roy Reen, Hal Lashwood, Harry Griffiths, Jack Burgess and Harry Avondale was a featured sketch in a Tuesday night variety show, Calling the Stars, and 5 million people tuned in.
Hey, Dad, there's a young lady at the door.
A young lady, the little trimmer.
Pronounce her, Harry. Go on, open the door and pronounce her.
Miss Olivia Shakespeare.
No, don't move. Just stand there. Oh, but how wonderful. Just like the three witches from Macbeth.
Strike me lucky, did you hear that? She said I had clean breeches and bad breath.
The Colgate-Palmolive unit was the largest unit of its type anywhere in the world at that time.
Perhaps the strangest form of radio show in the post-war years was the extraordinary mind-reading act staged by Sid Piddington and his wife.
I'll give you the line I've received. Just like the people of... That's the name of the town. The banker, W. Singh.
Is that near enough, boys?
Nobody believed it. We did. We tried to do them at other times in the studio beforehand, do little rehearsal things, and you couldn't trick them at any stage. And yet, the producer was a skeptic, but he said, I don't know how they do it.
Len London told me once that the first job he had on radio was on a ventriloquist show, and you wonder how a ventriloquist would get the message across on radio. Sponsored by Wrigley's, incidentally.
What are you going to do? I mean, do you want to be ground staff or air crew or what? I think ground staff. Ground staff? Yes. I want to stay on terra firma. The more firma, the less terror.
Another popular comedian of the day was George Wallace, who often used George Foster as the foil for his gags.
Have you heard the news?
What news, George?
It's fantastic, it is.
What is? What is?
Me, I'm going to have a lass at getting into Parliament.
Oh, not you.
Yeah,
too.
can you imagine? It's George Wallace, MLA.
Oh, you wouldn't know what MLA stands for.
I beg your dirty informal pardon.
Well, what would MLA stand for behind your name?
It stands for what I am. Magnificent, lovely, handsome.
The era produced many celebrated comedy writers, such as Fred Parsons, Alexander MacDonald, Willie Fennell and Dorothy Foster. Willie Fennell starred in Life with Dexter, based on the American comic strip Blondie.
You know, I really enjoyed that pick-a-box program tonight. I wonder what a man has to do to get on a show like that.
Hey, gee, Dad, you're thinking of trying to get on as a contestant?
Well, I wouldn't mind if I knew how to go about it. I guess you have to be someone special.
Well, you don't have to be special at all. You just have to be intelligent.
Oh, bad luck, Dad.
Yeah.
Other situation comedy series about average suburban families included the long-running Fred and Maggie Everybody, starring Edward Howell and Therese Desmond.
How many coupons have you got left, dear?
Not very many. Why, Maggie?
Well, I wanted you to lend me some. I must try and get some towels somehow.
Now, look, dear, if you haven't got enough coupons to buy towels, how are you going to pay me back any that I lend you?
Yes, well, I hadn't started to think about that, Fred.
Another favourite character from suburban life was actor Dan Agar's famous portrayal of the gossiping Mrs. Obbs. Writer Keith Smith discovered a rich vein of laughter in the honesty and freshness of children's minds and developed several hit shows, A Word from the Children and The Pied Piper.
Oh, do you think that fathers should help mothers do the washing?
Yes.
Why?
Oh, I think that they're stronger and that the woman has to do the housework and that father should help.
I wonder who dirties all the clothes at your house. Eh?
I suppose I'd be the worst.
Australians were treated to a host of short comedy series in the 1950s, including the memorable Idiots Weekly, starring the great British comedian Spike Milligan. And our comic actor Dick Bentley found fame with British radio shows like Take It From Here, which became big hits back home in Australia. But in terms of longevity, the most successful was the schoolroom farce Yes What? Produced at Station 5AD Adelaide, it was written by Rex Wackador, who also played the lead role of the harried schoolmaster.
Greenbuck, will you stop raving like a mad thing? That was William Tell, you idiot. Oh? William Tell. William didn't tell me that. Didn't he? No, the old man told me. Ah. My Uncle William never even met Richard the First.
Oh, well, there you are. Talking about that price.
Get out of here.
There was Rupert Bottomley, who was played by Ralph Peterson. He was the cheeky one.
Then there was Ronald George Stanforth, played by Jim Williams. He was the rather slow, dim-witted student. And then, of course, there was Horace Greenbottle, and he was the student that was always late, and the one that had the voices. They referred to it like a factory whistle. He was one of the great characters of Yes What.
The humour of the classroom proved so timeless that hundreds of recorded episodes of this 1930s classic were still being rebroadcast up to 40 years later.
Greenbottle, look, if you dare say another word about why you were late, I'll break every bone in your body.
As I'm sure you'll appreciate, all this great comedy attracted enormous audiences. It also sold a lot of soap and cosmetics as well. But the cost of these big and extravagant productions finally exceeded the advertising budgets of even the biggest national sponsors, and after only 8 years, they were forced to close down. So, coming up, the Quizmasters. Wisecracking comedians who moved on from the big variety productions to star in their own faster-paced and cheaper shows. There were two of them in particular. A zany vaudeville hillbilly named Bob Dyer, and everyone's favourite, the master of them all, Jack Davey. With the closure of the big-budget variety programmes, radio turned to an age-old format, the quiz show. To recall with us the wonderful years of Australian radio in the early 1950s, here's one of our most respected and best-loved comic actors, Ross Higgins.
Thanks, Roger. You're very kind. I first came into radio as a singer, but I went on to play many acting roles in plays and variety shows. Those productions were usually very carefully scripted, put together by many extraordinary, talented professionals, writers, actors, and producers. But there was one style of radio which relied for its success on the more spontaneous moments, quiz shows, where for the first time amateurs from the audience got involved. Quiz programs had appeared on radio in one form or another since the early 1930s. In 1934, Jack Davey hosted That's What You Think on 2GB. And during the war, he even hosted an army quiz called Rise and Shine, which may have been the last time there was any attempt at scripting the gags.
Corporal Challen, a nice little question for you, one that I think you'll like. Can you tell me the exact length of the Sydney Harbour Bridge?
1,762 feet, 11 inches in cold weather.
Tell me, that is correct, but how did you know? You have some
Oh, well, I was a junior draftsman with the engineers who built it.
Hey, give me my hand.
I'll do my best.
The first quiz shows on radio in the 1930s were intended to be a serious test of knowledge. But by the 1950s, the emphasis was on fast-paced entertainment. While some jokes could be set up in advance, contestants were still amateurs, and it was up to the quizmaster to generate the humour.
It comes under the heading of a pest, yes.
A mouse.
Yes.
A specific mouse?
No, it came from the Atlantic originally. It was an imported mouse.
He was in the master class. No one could touch him. And he could see humour, not only being uproariously funny himself, but he could see humour in every situation. When he came on and said, "Hi-ho, everybody," it just made you feel so good. And he was just phenomenal. A phenomenal entertainer, a phenomenal radio personality.
He quickly became the most popular radio performer. And for nearly 30 years, he was the highest paid entertainer in the country. But he also became famous for spending, gambling or giving away more money than he earned.
He didn't drink because it takes the edge off his weapon, which is his brain. A devastatingly quick wit. What most people don't realise, of course, he had an enormous capacity for work.
Yes, and I've picked young John Howard. He's a nice sort of lad, and he's been here 2 nights now, battling away, and he just hasn't had much luck.
Hi, John.
Not bad, thanks, Mr. Davey.
That's all right. What do you do for a living?
Oh, I still go to school.
Oh, you do? Yeah, what school?
Canterbury Boys High School.
Oh, that's... Right, let's get busy. In botany, a tree whose leaves fall in autumn is called a what sort of tree?
A shedding tree.
I could not look you straight in the face, John, and say that it was not a shedding tree, because there it is, busily shedding. So therefore it is. It's called a deciduous tree. But you've got the right idea. You've got 20 packets now.
If I'd have done better with the answers, I'd have taken away a washing machine. I think that was the ultimate prize, and I went away with bars of soap instead. But I think Mum had a washing machine, but it was perhaps getting a bit old then.
Jack Davey's talent was put to the test when he invited the visiting American comedy star Bob Hope onto his show.
And I was on his show just a few nights ago, and I'm sure that he's big enough to make a comeback. Thank you very, very much.
Now, I just don't say yes or no. That's all I've got to do.
You just don't say yes or no?
Yeah, you ask me things.
All right.
Personal things.
Personal things. No, seriously, did you ever have a guest star any cheaper?
Well, no, I don't suppose I did.
No, sir!
Jack Davey was a gambler and night owl, and his spendthrift lifestyle was in stark contrast to that of his greatest rival, Bob Dyer. Growing up in Tennessee, Dyer had known poverty and hunger as a struggling performer on the old vaudeville circuit. He amassed a fortune by controlling his own production company and producing radio shows based on slick setups and crazy gags.
This girl, failing to answer a riddle, had the task of choosing the ripest of 3 melons to win a consolation prize. All the melons have got more hair than Bob Dyer. He's the one on the left.
Please. Now, don't forget, the melon you select you can take home with you, right? Now, just over here, thump this one. And here's the second one. And there's the third one. Now, which one do you pick? The middle one! Now, wait a moment. There's only one way to find out. Here's a knife. Now, it's right on top of the melon. And now go when I count 3, cut. 1, 2, 3.
Bob didn't do too badly. He married one of the chorus girls, Dolly Mack. That's Dolly Dyer.
Dolly was the brains behind the program. Without her, Bob wouldn't have made it. She looked after all the editing. They were a self-contained unit.
One quiz show remained a serious knowledge test. The Quiz Kids was compared by urbane former schoolteacher John Deese and ran for many years on the Macquarie Network.
Welcome, listeners on 57 stations throughout Australia to the Quiz Kids Show.
What is the Dunmo flitch?
Well, it was a flitch of bacon that was awarded in England.
The big radio quiz lasted through the 1950s, but then slowly disappeared with the onslaught of television. Bob Dyer went on to make another fortune on TV, a medium perfectly suited to his folksy style, honed from years on the vaudeville stage. He was even clever enough to bring back one of Davey's brightest radio contestants, Barry Jones.
Here's Pressure Pack Jack Davey. Hi, everybody.
Jack Davey fell ill to cancer and died in 1959 at the age of only 49. Thousands attended his memorial service at Sydney's St Andrew's Cathedral, which was broadcast throughout Australia.
The crowd stands quietly as the Dean of Sydney reads the service, paying tribute to a man who, he says, occupied a unique place in the hearts of the people of Australia. Then, with a police motorcycle escort, the funeral procession moves off through the city which Jack Davey made his own. Everywhere, crowds stand silent and hushed, paying their respects to a star in the world of entertainment, a man whose wit, courage, and charitable works endeared him to every section of the community. Australia is poorer at his passing.
Jack Davey had been a radio star for almost 3 decades. His genius and enthusiasm as a producer, writer and entertainer shaped and defined Australian radio through its golden years. By the time he died in 1959, a programming revolution was underway that would change all the established ideas of broadcasting.
Thanks, Ross. And that's where we bring down the curtain on the theatre of the mind. In our next episode, we'll travel back to the very beginning to see how it all started. And we'll also look at the role played by women in Australian radio. It's quite a story and there's a lot more to come, so I hope you can join me. I'm Mike Hammond. Bye for now.